This is part 3 of why eschatology is important. And we've looked at the inevitability of eschatology. Everybody has an eschatology. You can look at communism and Nazism, humanism, Islam. Everybody has an eschatology. Christians, unfortunately, have adopted an eschatology that is defeatist regarding the future. Now, they wouldn't view it as defeatist because they think the rapture is going to take them out, and they see that as victory. The problem is every generation has pushed this idea that the rapture is right around the corner, or some view of the end times is right around the corner. And because of that, Christians have shortened the distance between the present and the future. And because there isn't much of a present, this world present, therefore they don't see any reason why they ought to be involved in the future at all. And the next part of this is to show you, to demonstrate from very popular Christian writers how they have put this into print by saying, look, we should live like people who don't expect to be around much longer. And there is this general attitude out there that we're on the cusp of some great eschatological event. Now, what I want to do in this segment is to deal with the integrity of the Bible. The integrity of the Bible is at stake in all of this. And I'm going to deal with the two individuals, and then I'm going to get into a little bit of eschatological, exegesis. Let's look at what the Bible has to say about where we are prophetically, and maybe it's possible that we are misinterpreting a great number of texts. Probably the most famous critic of the prophetic statements of Jesus was Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell wrote a book, Why He Was Not a Christian. And in it he said, look, the Bible makes some very interesting predictions about the future. Jesus, for example, predicted that he would come back, he would return within the lifetime of his own disciples, within the lifetime of that first generation. And he points to a couple of phrases from Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 16, beginning with verse 27. And he says, for the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Then Bertrand Russell went a little further in Matthew's Gospel to Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, where Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And Russell said, it's evident to the reader that Jesus predicted that he was going to return in some fashion prior to that particular generation passed away, prior to the last of his disciples dying, as Matthew 16, verses 27 through 28 state. And so there was a great deal of New Testament criticism that was written based upon the supposed false statements of Jesus. Bertrand Russell's was maybe the first one in the 20th century to point this out, but he wasn't the last one to point this out. Then there is Bart Ehrman. Many of you may know Bart Ehrman. He is famous for a number of books critical of the Christian faith. But what a lot of people may not realize is that Bart Ehrman went to an evangelical college, and he grew up with the end-time theology that is very prominent today. And through his studies, he came to the same conclusion that Bertrand Russell did. The New Testament predicts that Jesus is going to return in some capacity within a generation. And in fact, Bart Ehrman even mentions Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye as the writers that he read at the time and believed at the time. But a further study of the New Testament indicated to him that they were wrong, that Jesus was wrong about this. And the way that writers like Tim LaHaye and Hal Lindsey were manipulating the text in order to make it fit that particular interpretation just didn't work. And anybody who reads Matthew chapter 24, for example, and we'll look at some of this, will come to the conclusion, as I did as a young seminary student, that Jesus was in fact stating very clearly that he was going to return in some capacity before that first century generation passed away. He would return before the last disciple of his day died. There is no doubt that that's what the New Testament says. In fact, every modern-day prophecy writer knows that's the first impression you get when you look at Matthew chapter 24. When Jesus says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place," they're very confident that's exactly what Jesus is stating. But they try to get around it in various ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then throughout the 20th century, there were those who were predicting the end. There was Oswald J. Smith in 1926 who wrote a book on the Antichrist. Said that the Antichrist was on the horizon, and it was Benito Mussolini. All the prophetic texts seemed to fit that it was Benito Mussolini, but in reality, they were misapplied. Mussolini was executed in 1945. Oswald J. Smith was wrong. Oswald J. Smith actually admitted that he was wrong. Then, of course, you had World War II coming on the scene with Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was perceived to be the Antichrist, the beast of Revelation chapter 13. And you begin to see, well, they were wrong about him as well. Then a book came out in 1970 by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth. And this was a multi-time bestseller. It was deemed to be the most popular nonfiction book of the 1970s, sold tens of millions of copies. Now, compare that with the Left Behind series. The Left Behind series has 16 volumes and has probably sold in the neighborhood of 70 million copies. You have Hal Lindsey's single volume, came out in 1970, and has sold in the neighborhood of around, maybe 20 to 25 million copies, a single book. Had a powerful impact on the 1970s and upon the church. Written in 1970, the primary focus of the book was on Israel becoming a nation again in 1948. And Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, where it says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And Hal Lindsey had stated that a generation was 40 years. And we can do the math. It's very simple. Israel became a nation again in 1948. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And Hal Lindsey said, which generation? He says, the generation that sees Israel become a nation again. Well, the generation that saw Israel become a nation again existed in 1948. So you add 40 years to 1948, you get 1988. So there was this preoccupation that the 1980s was going to be the last decade before Jesus returned. In fact, there was even a book written by Edgar Wisnant that said 88 reasons why the rapture is going to be in 1988. This was the prophetic phenomenon of the 1970s and the 1980s. Chuck Smith did the same thing. People were calculating based upon Israel becoming a nation again in 1948. Now, what a lot of people don't know is a similar type of calculation took place in the early part of 1917 or so with the signing of the Balfour Declaration, giving the Jews the right to repossess the land, something that didn't take place until 1948. And they saw that as the generation that Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 24. The only problem is that generation began to die out. You had people refocusing and say, no, it wasn't until 1948. Now, since we've passed 1988, you have to come up with a new way of explaining why this is an error. And so people would say it was 1948, but it really wasn't until 1967 during the Six-Day War. And so, but if you add 40 to 1967, you get 2007. So that didn't work out. Then they changed the nature of the timing of how long a generation is. The Bible can't be that unclear. Jesus made it very clear what he was saying in Matthew chapter 24, and all of these attempts to try to force the Bible into a preconceived paradigm has, I believe, brought disrepute to the Bible. People reject the Bible. Liberal scholars, Bart Ehrman, is a good example of it. He even admits that it was his reading of these texts and reading these books that led him into skepticism of the Bible. In his best-selling book, Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman describes how he struggled to reconcile what he had been taught about the inerrancy of the Bible with what he believed to be predictive errors made by Jesus. His trek down the road toward skepticism and unbelief begins with what he describes as, and I'm quoting, one of the most popular books on campus that was being read while he was a student at Moody Bible Institute in the 1970s, Hal Lindsey's apocalyptic blueprint for our future, The Late Great Planet Earth. Ehrman writes that he was particularly struck by the win of Lindsey's prophetic outline of Matthew chapter 24. Now, this probably isn't the only reason that Bart Ehrman rejected the Christian faith, but it was something that added fuel to the fire. He says, if Jesus is wrong about this, and Bertrand Russell had already made that case, if Jesus is wrong about this, then it's a good possibility that he's wrong about other things. And then there's the possibility here that it was the disciples who manufactured all of this in order to create a scenario where people would see the end of the world coming about in their day, and that they would then come to this newfound faith, and every generation has done the same thing. So we've seen how everybody has an eschatology. We've seen how Christians have discounted the future based upon an eschatology that is defeatist this side of a so-called rapture. We've seen how people have in effect been affected by this view of eschatology, especially the predictive elements of, say, Matthew chapter 24 and so forth. So the question comes down to now, are there exegetical reasons for abandoning this modern day preoccupation with the end times, with this idea that we are living on the precipice of a significant eschatological event based upon passages like Matthew chapter 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, the book of Revelation, Ezekiel 38 and 39, 2 Thessalonians 2, and other such passages. So what I want to do after going through this kind of brief introduction is to look at a couple of these passages, these prophetic passages, and to show how, if you take Jesus at His word, you let the Bible interpret itself, that we come up with a completely different view of prophecy. And what I'm going to deal with in this next segment isn't anything new. This isn't new to me. It isn't something I've manufactured. It isn't something I've discovered on my own. I'm not bringing anything really new to the table. Christian scholars, Christian commentators have been dealing with these prophetic texts in the same way that I'm going to present them to you, and to show you that this way of looking at Scripture is in fact transformational.